Wouldn't it be wonderful if the climate catastrophe could be a good catastrophe? Stay with me for a while and I'll explain just what I mean by a good catastrophe. But first of all, think about a fairy tale. All good fairy tales begin once upon a time. So, once upon a time there was a village filled with entrepreneurs, investors, people who were buying their products, and all of the other people necessary to make a village work. And over time, more and more of the people in the village were raised out of poverty. More and more people in the village had a good life because every day they followed the teaching of their religion, neoclassical economics. Everyone praised their religion, neoclassical economics, saying, "This is magnificent. We've found the answer. We've found the way to create a good life. And we've proven that the religions of the neighboring villages are wrong." But some remained in poverty. And so a few questioned the value of the religion. A few questioned whether neoclassical economics was right or not. But the high priest of the religion said, "No, keep working harder, try harder, and we will get there. Everyone will be lifted out of poverty. Everyone will have a good life." Until one day, enough people in the village accepted that the village was now in the early stages of an irreversible collapse because the village had overshot 7 of the 9 limits. Because of this, more and more began the traumatic inner work of changing their beliefs, of letting go of their belief in the religion of neoclassical economics that seemed to have served them so well, and yet was now taking them ever deeper into a catastrophe. They knew that they had to do this inner work at the same time as doing the outer work of transforming how they invested in businesses, how they ran businesses, and how the entire marketplace worked. Now let's have a look at what Tolkien might say. Imagine we were characters in a story that J.R.R. Tolkien had written. He would write in all of the wizards and the heroes and all of the everyday people doing heroic things and wizardry things. He'd build in also on the other side some wizards and some anti-heroes, people who were pushing hard to defend the beliefs in neoclassical economics. He would recognize that what we were dealing with was a clash between 2 competing belief systems. He'd recognize everybody on all sides was completely convinced that their belief was the only true and right belief. He'd take the catastrophe to the same point as in Lord of the Rings, where it really looked as if Sauron was going to win. And at that point, some surprise would come in. You'd realize that this catastrophe was actually turning around towards the good. You'd realize that everybody had experienced their darkest hours because that experience was necessary for the turn to the good. It was necessary to be part of the learnings that fed into transforming the catastrophe into a good catastrophe at the end. And Tolkien recognized that this was such a key feature of all good fairy stories that he coined a word for it. He called it a Eucatastrophe. He took the Greek word for good and added the "eu" in the beginning before the word catastrophe to point at a good catastrophe. Tolkien knew that a good catastrophe is exactly what made fairy stories valuable, because they gave everyone a powerful way of thinking so that they could keep going even when times were really tough, even when it looked as if everything was lost. And they gave a powerful way of finding options that would tip the odds towards a good catastrophe and away from a bad catastrophe. Let's also take a look at what the late Archbishop Desmond Tutu might say. I recall listening to a number of his talks growing up in South Africa and reading his books afterwards. And there are 2 of his messages that have really stayed with me ever since then and have guided a lot of what I do. The first is, we must give up all hope of having a different past. And the second is, we're all victims of the system. What these 2 messages mean for me now and have meant for me for many years is that we have to accept that we are in the early stages of collapse. We have to give up all endeavors that can only work if we can change the past, if there's a way of having a different past. And we need to recognize that in many senses we're all victims of the deeper belief system that we're embedded in. So let's turn to what Dietrich Bonhoeffer might say. For those who don't know him, Dietrich Bonhoeffer was executed by the Nazis just before the end of the war for his role internally in Germany for attempting to bring the war to an end. He was a priest, and he wrote a number of essays that were very insightful and have relevance today. One of his essays was his essay on stupidity. Bonhoeffer would say, as would Desmond Tutu, that we must do this with compassion, because very, very few of us are doing this out of malevolent, evil intent. Rather, we're doing it because we've been made stupid. We're all victims of the religion, made stupid by the structures, the beliefs, everything that we've been embedded in. So what can we all do now to tip the odds towards a good catastrophe? This is our focus in Evolutesix for 2025, is tipping the odds towards a good catastrophe. We weren't quite comfortable with Tolkien's word, Eucatastrophe. Marie, he came up with an alternative word, a catastrophe, from the Greek word kata, which is down, and the Greek word strophe, which is a turning. So catastrophe is a downward turn, and the Greek word pano, which is up. So a panostrophe would be an upturn, and a catastrophe is exactly the good catastrophe we're talking about, where there's a downturn, everything looks as if it's completely lost and there's no hope, until something happens and it turns up again. So that's what we're after, is creating a catastrophe. Now, let's not delude ourselves. The catastrophic part is still there in a catastrophe. There is still going to be climate change. There is still going to be enormous levels of pain, suffering, conflict, clash. It may well stay a catastrophe. The pano part of it may not come in our lifetimes. It may not come in the next couple of generations. But if we keep our focus on a catastrophe, on laying the foundations for what can we create that will create the upturn, that we believe is the best thing that we can put our time, money, and effort into now. What it means is we need to do this in ways that are contrary to the teachings of neoclassical economics, to the mainstream teachings of today, and to many of our beliefs. It means we need to use the existential trauma that we're dealing with to feed, to drive, to steer the inner work we need to do and the outer work we need to do. It is going to be traumatic to accept that collapse is happening, that there's nothing we can do to stop it, and to go on this inner and outer journey into collapse, through collapse, and out of it. This is part of what Evolutesix does with people. The Evolutesix adaptive way is an integration of the most powerful approaches we've found yet to go on the inner transformational journey we need to go on to change our beliefs, and to work with people to harness tension and conflict between people as an upward turning, as a generative source of transformation. And this is necessary because it's dysfunctional to go at the world thinking because they are part of the problem, they cannot be part of the solution. Instead, we need to shift our thinking to saying, because I've been part of the problem, because you've been part of the problem, we have to be part of the solution. And we can be part of the solution. The adaptive way is a perfect way of doing that. Another belief that has to go is the belief that portfolio-based investing is a viable solution to the problems we face today. It's not. We have to shift our belief in averages, in portfolio-based investing, into what can work to deliver a catastrophe, which is ecosystem-based investing for entrepreneurs and for investors to do, because it means instead of investing in individual companies, which cannot ever deliver regenerative, impact, sustainable, climate, etc. outcomes, it's now time to invest in entire diverse ecosystems of companies via an ecosystem holding company. Maybe 2025 is your year to do even more than you have been doing. Or perhaps it's your year to start. Perhaps it's your year to start up your own startup. Perhaps it's your year to decide to leave the comfortable corporate job that has given you security for so long, but that you're no longer happy in. Maybe it's time for you to act as an internal change agent inside your company and transform it to one that is truly net positive. Evolutesix is here to help you on that as well, with our accelerator program and our health check on whether the foundations of your company are sufficiently strong to support your being a fully regenerative contributor to the economy. At the very least, shift even more of your capital, your time, your intelligence, and your effort into businesses that are truly, from the ground up, building a net positive economy. So back to the fairy story. And happily ever after is how all good fairy stories end. They end that way because of the catastrophe, or as Tolkien coined it, the Eucatastrophe. And so many of the ordinary heroes in the village, along with the wizards, all of the everyday people, all of them were heroes. They came together in small and large groups, and they talked about their memories. They talked about their memories of the ancient ways that they'd had before the religion was adopted. They talked about all of the things that they'd learnt, experienced. They worked with each other to let go of beliefs that were preventing them from seeing what worked. They saw clearly how neoclassical economics had lifted many people into high standards of living, higher standards of living than the kings and queens of old had ever been able to enjoy. And at the same time, they became more and more clear that it was not working, that it could never work for all because of what was wrong. They saw that very often what did work was the opposite of what was being taught in neoclassical economics. Sometimes what worked was completely different to anything that they'd ever seen before. And so they started doing more and more of what worked, regardless of what their beliefs said, ignoring instructions from the religions and the beliefs, until they got to something that really did work for all. Sometimes what worked for all simply looked like an upgraded version of the ancient ways or the ways of the religion. Sometimes what worked for all looked nothing like any of those. Sometimes what worked for all looked just like what had been claimed in the enemy religions that they'd been rejecting for decades. But at the end, by bringing together everything that worked for all, they turned what they had been convinced was an unavoidable catastrophe into a catastrophe. Then they looked back at the hardships, at the pain, at the price everyone had paid, and they realized how much they'd grown, how what they now had that was good could never have emerged without that. And so they had the best party ever and lived happily ever after.